Okay. I first came to Australia in 1974. I was on my way to Malaysia and I thought that Australia was on the way. That lets you know that geography has never been one of my strongest subjects. I came back in '79 when a teachers union sent me around the country as a one-man crew squad following Milton Friedman. And it was in '79 that in Perth that I was asked what right did I have to criticize the Australian economy, and that's when I said we owned it. That was 1979, and that was basically after 30 years of unbelievably positive economic growth in the United States. Between right after World War II to 1977, the economy doubled and every segment of the economy benefited from it. So talking about how great American economy was, nowadays if you ask me, America doesn't own anything. So not only do we, somebody else must own the Australian economy because we don't. And you know, we're celebrating all the great things, America's greatest corporation, Apple and Steve Jobs. Nobody really knows what Steve Jobs' real name was. And you'll hear it now, and this is the first time it really gets out. His real name is Steve Jobs in China. He just chopped it back in order to be politically acceptable. All the jobs and everything that we had since then, now in America, goes to the top 1%. And that now raises a whole question about where do we go and what kind of a world we have, and now the imperative of democracy. When I started talking democracy way back then, it was a good idea. It was nice. And it was good to be able to open up the system and make it more accessible to everybody. So I was into access and equity, and that's what I was talking about. But we can't talk about that anymore. The system is totally broken. The political system doesn't work, not only here or in the United States or anywhere else in the world. And the economic system doesn't work. The economic system now is organized to maximize profits for the smallest number of people. So between '77 and now, nothing came to any of the people, and now we have to start, how do we think our way out of it? Because if we don't, democracy is no longer something that's a good idea, it's an absolute essential. It's an absolute prerogative. So now the really question is that we have three things. We could spend a lot of time talking about why the system won't work. I think you don't need a lot of discussion on that. I don't think we're coming up, I think you've seen a little bit about what's happening in America and its political things, and you've heard who the Republicans are going to put up to be president. And I'm sure you got some chuckles out of that. But, you know, the first four presidents of the United States warned us that if we were going to have, and none of them like democracy, but if we're going to have any kind of a representative republic, we needed an enlightened citizen. It was part of George Washington's farewell address. John Adams, who followed him, said something very similar. Jefferson went on this. And Madison pointed out if we don't have enlightened citizens, it's a prelude to farce or tragedy or both. If you've been following the Republican nomination, you've seen farce. If you wait till November, you may see tragedy. But the one thing we do know is that there is no hope without enlightened citizens. And so the real question now is, what do we mean by democracy? Everybody talks about it. We went to Iraq and brought democracy to Iraq, and people believe that. And there's one thing we do have to say about the Australian, no matter how dumb a war the United States fights, And the Iraq War was dumb, but the Afghanistan War is twice as dumb. But we can all, whoever is Prime Minister of Australia at the moment says, is this war dumb enough for us? And we said, yeah, it's pretty dumb. And they said, you can count us in. And so, even the age, which doesn't come to things very rapidly, as you all know, even the age now says, we better be out of Afghanistan. The Prime Minister doesn't say that. And if you're looking at what's happening in the United States, not only they don't want us out of Afghanistan, but all those people who are running for president want us to be in Iran. And if you think Afghanistan was dumb, we can show you real dumbness in Iran. All right, so we got these things that aren't working. Now we have to say, what is it that democracy looks like? What are its fundamental principles, so we just don't call anything democracy? And then, more importantly, how do we go from where we are, which is not in a very good situation, to where we need to go? So let's talk a little bit about what democracy looks like. What is a democracy, and what makes it a democracy? I asked some students in the class earlier, and they said, well, democracy is voting. No, it isn't. Democracy has nothing to do with voting. In fact, in the United States, it's not voting, it's counting that makes the difference. But voting has nothing to do with democracy. A constitution has nothing to do with democracy. Rule of law has nothing to do with democracy. Those are kinds of things that we throw at people so we don't have to seriously talk about what a democracy is. Well, democracy is made up of 7 fundamental principles. The more we understand those principles, the quicker we can begin to turn things around. The first and most important principle of a democracy is knowledge. Democracy is basically the triumph of reason. Without knowledge, dumb people cannot have a democracy. Ignorance is not possible for democracy. Ignorant voters are more dangerous than homicidal maniacs with machine guns. They do more damage. So the question is, what kind of knowledge and where is that knowledge to be gotten from? And here's where we run into one of the reasons the system isn't working. At one time, we can look to that knowledge in newspapers. You're not going to find that knowledge in newspapers now. At one time, community organizations, unions, and fraternal organizations helped build that understanding. They don't do that anymore. But the one thing that the 4 presidents called for was schools. That the idea to have a public school, the idea that you could tax everybody so that people would come, their children could go to school, was based on a simple thought. That this was a public good. This was necessary for the survival of a society. And yet we now have schools where kids graduate who know absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. I was teaching a course with university students, all of whom aspire to be teachers, just in the winter. And I asked the students, it was actually last spring, who rules Libya? Not one of the 37 students could tell me who ruled Libya. 37 students in the university, having already gone through 12 years of successful K through 2 schooling, been able to be admitted to a high prestige university, not one could tell me. Then I asked my 7-year-old granddaughter, and she said Gaddafi. Then I went back and explained to the students why it was that my 7-year-old granddaughter had only been in school a little more than a year, could answer the question, and they who had been in school for 12 plus years couldn't. And the answer is pretty simple. They hadn't been in school long enough to become stupid. And that's exactly what we're doing now, is we're bringing people through school, graduating, and making sure they don't know anything. Because nothing of importance is discussed in school. Nothing. They have no idea how an economy works. So 56% of the people, according to the age, think the Liberals will do a better job with the economy than Labour. But it says as much they have no idea what you do in the economy, why would we ask them? If you then ask them, okay, tell me a little bit about monetary power, huh? How about fiscal power, huh? I don't know anything about that, but I know which party can do a better job. No, they don't. And they have to. Because how can you possibly talk about dealing with the kind of problems we have without knowing anything about economics? Certainly by the time the students in third grade, they should be able to work out a better tax policy than either we have in Australia or the United States. Maybe the second grade, when I look at tax policies. But certainly they should be able to do that. And yet we never ask them. We never ask them to be able to deal with any of the kind of problems that they have to be able to deal with. And so one of the fundamental principles of a democracy is knowledge. Not any kind, not useless knowledge, not who's going to win the grand final, but that kind of knowledge that makes it possible for them to be meaningful participants in decision-making that affects their lives. Now, how do we teach that? How does that be taught? Particularly now. Well, one of the first things you have to understand that will ultimately, if we survive, will ultimately distinguish a 19th century education, which is what we have in the United States and Australia, from a 21st century education, is that in the 21st century education, students discover. That we don't tell them, they discover. And so a part of our job is to help them know how to discover, to help them know how to take information, be able to organize it into an argument, make it a proposal, and be capable of taking that proposal and debating it with people who've done the same. Where do we do that? And we need to be doing that all the time. If we don't do that, the only thing we're doing in school is creating docile followers. And no country needs docile followers. Docile followers is what part of fascism. A friend of mine named Bert Gross in 1979 wrote a book called Friendly Fascism. You can pick it up because it's selling more now. Bert died in 97. But people are now reading it when they didn't read it in 79. And basically what Bert Gross said is that we've now been able to build a fascist state, a corporate-dominated state, in most of the Western things, without having to use stormtroopers. We just let the people do it for themselves. We let them to mindlessly go along and follow the leader and do what they're told, and in no way become meaningful participants in the decisions of that society. That allows them to get us into dumb wars. It allows them to be able, speaking of those wars, way back, before Reagan was president, I was invited to do what was called executive seminars, in which high-ranking bureaucrats in all the departments would come, including generals and admirals, and we would talk about things. And at that time, I was indicating that I thought the military budget was too high, and I proposed an alternative which I thought was $1.50. And the argument for the $1.50 was, since all Americans have guns, we don't have to arm them. They just bring, if they want to fight a war, they bring their own guns. And if they want to go fight somewhere, they pay for the transportation. And if they want to come back, they pay for a round trip. So $1.50. And an Army general seriously asked me, what would I do with $1.50? Now, if you weren't worried about the United States military before, think about that. So I told him I would do what the military budget at that time was 80 billion, it's now over 600 billion. I told him I would do the same thing that he does with 80 billion, I'd waste it. But I told him I was reasonable. We could compromise. How about 40 billion and 75 cents? So an army general said I didn't understand. They had planes that were older than their pilots. I told them to get older pilots. Now, that was then. That was when there was a Soviet Union. That was when there was a Cold War. That's when there was a threat. Now, no Soviet Union, no Cold War threat. As many as 800 million military overseas bases. 800 in 130 plus countries. A new one here in Australia, as if you needed another military base. As if China is going to come and attack you. They may choose to get mad at you and refuse to send you iPods. But that's the biggest danger you have. And $600 billion, which is more basically than the rest of the world put together. Meanwhile, we have no money for infrastructure. We have no money for education. And for God's sakes, don't talk about money for health. The last thing we want to do is see a healthy American. So there we are. So that's the kind of knowledge we need to get. So what's the next thing we need to do? Well, it's an essential part of any democracy is encouraging every single person to be able to think for themselves. To be able to be a reasonably participant person in dealing with the thought that's necessary to work in any society. But political effectiveness comes from collective action. What we need to have is students understanding how they work collaboratively with others to bring about change. If you want to be able to develop adequate citizens by the time they have had 12 years of education, they need 12 years of practice in citizenship. They need 12 years of working together to bringing about certain kinds of community change. And it's not that hard to do. When I was in Santa Cruz and I was in the school board there, I was working with a small little group of students in an alternative school, which I call the Alternative School for Social Justice. And I went there and I said, we need to change something in this school. What do we think we need to change? And they said the food. And I said, well, there's only 30 of us. There's 560 in Gaul. We can't make the decision. You have to do a survey. So they did the survey, and they taught them how to do some simple statistics, and it was true. They were right. The students pointed out that the biggest problem in Gaul school was the food. And the teachers and administrators should have figured it out, because the biggest problem were food fights. However, okay, I said, let's now, I'm on the school board, I get a bus, we go down and we talk to the superintendent. And the superintendent comes out, and they appointed this little 7-year-old Luke to be their spokesperson. And the superintendent said, what can I do for you? And Luke says, how come we have this lousy food at Gaul? And the superintendent says, how can you call it lousy? Our nutritionists say it's good for you. Luke said, how can it be good for you if nobody eats it? They got a new food program that won them a national award. I met Luke not so long ago, 20 years later, he's now a lawyer, and he says that's still the best day of his life. It can be done by any grade, any time, and you change the whole character of citizenship, and we move from just passive followers to active participants and empowered participants. And so that's another important principle of a democracy. Principle of having knowledge, knowing where to get it, knowing how to assemble it, and then know how to collectively work with others. And we have to understand, democracy is exponential function. Every important democratic movement started with a handful of people, far fewer than they have in this room. Doesn't make any difference. As I talk to a bunch of middle school kids, I say, okay, 10 of you go out, and you convince 10 others in the next minute, and that group convince 10 others in the next minute, and that other group convince 10 others in the next minute. How many minutes will it take for everybody in the world to be convinced? Okay, 8th graders. 10 minutes. That's 10 to the 10th power is 8 billion. That means we convinced everybody 1.5 times. So they all tell me that's impossible. And I said, of course it's impossible. You have more than 10 minutes and you don't have to convince everybody. But that's the understanding that they have to have. That if we want a democracy, each of us goes out and becomes part of getting others to be involved. I'll talk more about that if I have time. As I understand it, you listen to me, I talk to you. If you get done before I do, you tell me. No? All right, okay. Authority. Democratic authority. Authority has always been a problem for democracy. But if we look at America, the whole revolution was fought over the issue of authority. If you look at psychological research on democracy, all of it was done on authority. It goes way back when Kurt Lewin and his students did these studies on democratic authority and compared it with what they called authoritarian and laissez-faire, and they found that democratic authority was superior. They were not exactly great experiments, but it was sort of sad. All the experiments stopped at that time, when we ought to be looking at and examining authority. Well, democratic authority is different than either anarchy or guardianship. This is what Bob Dahl, one of the democratic theorists, talks about. But a democratic authority is, remember, teachers are not elected. They have no democratic authority when they walk into a classroom. So how can they be legitimate authorities? And the problem is, you have to understand, is that a lot of them are not accepted as legitimate authorities. If you look at the research of students and their teachers, you find that depending on what the teacher is and what kind of a school and what kind of a neighborhood and what age group and things of that nature, that a certain percentage of them fully accept the teacher's authority. And then there's a slightly larger percent are passive acceptors. And then there's a reasonably high percent that are passive resistors. And then there's X number of percent, depending on the school, that are actively opposed to that authority. They get in trouble, they don't stay very long, but no one is always they're the ones to be blamed. No one is questioning whether or not that authority was legitimate, whether that the student really had a reason to accept that authority. Well, there are two kinds of ways that teachers can become more legitimate. Legitimate being accepting of that authority. One is by making a more persuasive case that what they're teaching is worth learning. And that's a problem that I had when I was a kid. I never could find anything that the teachers were teaching me that I thought was worth learning. And I'd always ask the teachers a question that always got me in trouble was, why do I have to learn that? And they would always tell me, I'll need it when I grow up. I'm near 90, but anybody who knows me, I haven't grown up. That's an unbelievably dumb answer to a legitimate question. So you have to make a case that what we're teaching is worth learning. But you also have to negotiate. You have to be willing to hear why the student doesn't and negotiate. And through persuasion and negotiations, we move to a more legitimate authority and make But we need to accept that from everybody, in every situation. That's what we need to have in police officers. That's what we need to have in government officials, bureaucrats. We need to have the understanding that in a democracy, they have to be democratic authorities. And they just can't impose their will and still call themselves a democracy. Inclusion is the fourth thing. A democracy is inclusive. It welcomes everybody equally. It celebrates all, and it affords everybody with all the same rights and privileges, identical rights and privileges. And all the movements here in Australia or in the United States where we moved in the direction of democracy all came from struggles for inclusion. It was struggles and inclusion that changed the character, the understanding of America, of people. It was women's fights for suffrage, was important, but even as important was labor struggles for its rights to organize and fight for job conditions and wages. But so too has been with the rights of, but the ones that still have yet to be fought and won. The rights of Native peoples for their position, rights of gays and lesbians for their rights, and certainly rights for immigrants. All of that has to be part of the whole notion of moving toward a democracy by understanding a democracy is inclusive. Another thing that makes a democracy, and in fact, it's the foundation on which democracies are built, are rights. In what in the United States at that time were called inalienable. Actually, it was Jefferson called them inalienable, and Adams called them unalienable, but they meant the same thing, and that is you couldn't take them away. These are things that everybody has that protects them against abuse of government. Without those rights, the United States would long have since disappeared. Without those, and we go through episodes where those rights are under a tremendous attack, never more than today. What are those rights? Rights of expression. Congress shall pass in America First Amendment that prohibits the right of speech, the right of religion, the right to press, the right to petition, the right to assembly. Those are fundamental rights. Without them, you can't have a democracy. They don't exist in school. If they don't exist in school, don't expect students to understand them and fight for them. The right to privacy. The right to a due process system that has presumption of innocence, right not to testify against oneself, trial by jury, habeas corpus, things that are more and more absent from the United States, and I don't know what's happening here, but I imagine they're not in as good a shape as they should be. And rights to movement. We will have those rights when students have them, and when teachers have them, particularly rights to expression. Now, the one that Lynne was talking about, and that where I got all started with, was how do we create environments where people can grow to their fullest potential? And that all stems from disagreeing why it was that some students succeeded and some students failed. The prevalent thinking historically is that students fail because there's something wrong with them. They didn't choose their parents wisely. They had bad genes. Made in China. inferior cultures, thousands of reasons, and I argued that none of them apply. And that's how I got involved with doing things that I was doing. I argued that they all came as a result of differential encouragement. And the three that I started with are the ones that Lynne mentioned, the belonging, usefulness, and competence. And I stole them from early writings of Karl Marx on alienation. That he had argued that was one of the things that happened when people gave up craft to work in factories. They lost these things. And I figured that worked. But over the years, I've added another 7. And we began to deal with it. But I think it's important to know what happens when you test them. What happens when, for example, I brought 160 totally inadmissible students to the University of Oregon, all with stay 9s or 0. It meant they had a 0 probability of graduating in 4 years. 25% were African American, 25% were Latino, mostly Mexican American, 25% were Native American, 25% were poor whites. 4 years later, as high a percentage of them graduated as did the admissible students. Helping me a lot with all of those was Ken Pope, and couldn't have done it without him. And then we did it with another group of people that were even worse. And this was a high school equivalency group of people who had never had high school graduation, and they were admitted, and they also succeeded. I felt with that there would never be any more of this deficit thinking. We had finished it. But even more was another project that I worked with, which was called New Careers, in which we managed to create a whole different approach to how one got to get a credential. Rather than having to go through the university, get your education first and then your credential, we argue, Frank Reisman and I, that you get your job first and then you get your education. How do you do that? You take every one of these credentials and you break them down into a ladder. The initial rung is open to everybody, regardless of prior education, skill, or experience. And then while working on the job and getting education from the university, but also by learning on the job as a combination of higher education and apprenticeship, you move up to a series of rungs from an aide to an assistant to associate to being a credential. The largest of that was a career opportunity program, in which 20,000 people in a short period of time, before Richard Nixon abolished the program, before got their degrees, all of them were poor. Almost the majority were African American women on welfare. But there were Native Americans, there were Newts in Alaska that had never had a credentialed teacher at the end of 4 years. They had 9. There were Crow, who had 9 teachers. At the end of 4 years, they had 90. It was amazingly successful. And I had an opportunity to go to one of them on a 20-year anniversary. That was the one in Minnesota. Here they were almost all black women. And the reason they had this 20-year celebration, because one of the women who went on to get 2 master's degrees was Prince's mother, the artist known as Prince. My daughter Esther was very excited that I was going to get a chance to meet Prince. I didn't know who Prince was. I knew who Count was. I knew who Duke was. Well, I never met him. But it was a lavish spread, and I met her, and there was this big advertisement that they had on there, New Careers, the dream that worked, and she crossed the dream out and put nightmare. And she explained to me that here they were going to schools that didn't want them, they were going to the University of Minnesota that didn't want them, and then they had to go home and take care of 1 to X number of kids, and yet almost 100% of them succeeded. And she explained the reason they succeeded. One was they were not going to lose this opportunity. that one of the important things that we talk about now, when we talk about creating that optimum learning environment, is hope. They had hope. For the first time in their lives, they saw a possibility, and they were not going to lose it, no matter how much they were going to be discouraged. And the other thing, which is what I built into all the programs I work with now, is that they actually work very hard helping each other. They built this kind of collective thing that I think is absolutely imperative for citizenship participation, absolutely imperative for any kind of successful growth of people, and they work together, and that's why 20 years later they all knew each other. But that's also pretty true of the programs we work with. 40 years later, we still know them, and they make efforts to keep in touch with us. So, these become absolute essential part, knowing them. And the last one, of course, is equality. I'm watching. I only got 45 to an hour more.
Keep going.
Sorry.
No, I didn't.
I missed number 6.
What's that?
I missed number 6. What's number 6?
All right. First is knowledge. Second is working and learning how to work collectively. Third is authority. Fourth is inclusiveness. Fifth is rights. I haven't got to 7 yet. And 6 is an optimal learning. 7th is equality. And equality, every democracy claims to have equality. None even comes close. And one of the reasons they have difficulty is they have difficulty in defining it. Conservatives define equality as everybody treated exactly the same. And Jonathan Rawls, speaking for liberals, said everybody should have an equal result. Well, nobody believes either of those. But there is one kind of definition of equality that everybody can accept, and that everybody has equal access to an optimum learning environment. Everybody has equal opportunity to grow to fullest potential. That kind of equality we can come up with. So I've given you much too quickly in ways of defining democracy. But the real issue here, the one we have to work on, is how do we get from where we are to where we want to go? It starts with us understanding what democracy means. But that's not enough. It does require us to insist that classrooms operate with democratic principles. It does require us to make sure that everybody that becomes a teacher understands that the foremost responsibility, basically the only important responsibility a teacher has, is to prepare an informed citizen. Everything else becomes insignificant. What else do people have to know if they don't know enough to be able to have some influence over their lives? What else is important? So unless we do that, everything else becomes unimportant. And that has to be part of every course as students understand democracy and their capacity to deal with it. But it's not going to only happen in schools. That's an important place. It's a place you can't ignore. But it has to happen other places as well. And it has to happen with each and one of us. We have to understand that it's our responsibility to talk democracy with people. To raise the issues and to talk about things that need to be done. To talk about what kind of economic policy, what kind of environmental policy, what kind of policy that would make it possible for Native peoples to be able to have meaningful participation in their society and be able to continue to function from their own cultural backgrounds and perspectives. What kinds of policies are necessary to keep us out of stupid wars? And any war from now on is a stupid war. There's no way you can talk about a smart war. No war will give you a satisfactory result. You just kill a lot of people, make a lot of enemies, and have gained nothing from it. So we need to be talking about that. And one of the things that really bothers me, back in the 60s when we were at the University of Oregon, people were talking about it all the time. You go to a university now and people don't want to talk about anything. Well, at Oregon they want to talk about the football team because they had a big year. Yeah. I had 4 football players in my class in the spring, and the name of the football coach is Chip Kelly. And I talked about this. Chip Kelly had found this great high school recruit, the greatest athlete they ever had, but he couldn't get into the University of Oregon. And so Chip was able to get to the university to appoint a committee of 4 people, one from the math department, one from the youth department, one from the science department, and 4 people. And then if he could successfully get through those 4 people, they would admit him. So they came in with this recruit, and the first person to talk to him was the math professor, and he said, "Okay, young man, the question I'm asking you is how much is 2 plus 2? And the athlete said 4. And Chip Kelly jumped up, "Give him another chance, please, give him another chance." I told that to the 4 football players. One of them said, "I get it." So we need to have these kind of conversations. And if we're not having this conversation, we'll not have this democracy. But it'll come a lot faster than you think it will. There's an enormous potential of people understanding things aren't working. But they feel helpless. They don't have any idea what they can do. But when you start having these conversations, then you talk about things we're going to do. Then you begin to propose certain kinds of actions. You rekindle 40 years ago, if you were in Australia, there were meaningful political clubs. Everybody I knew in Australia belonged to a club. They were actively involved in the political life of the community. That doesn't exist anymore. The same was true in the United States. That doesn't exist anymore. So you begin to establish meeting together, talking about things, reading books, discussing things, and then actually becoming what needs to be done is building candidacies from the ground up. Rather than people coming to you and saying, "Vote for me," you decide who you want to represent you. I insist that anybody that wants to be president should never be allowed to be elected. That alone should disqualify them. But if you really begin to develop this kind of culture, this kind of groundswell, this kind of building from the bottom up, we can turn around this country and make it work. Turn around this world and make it work. So in fairness to myself, I don't think it's fair to say that it's Art Pearl against the world. I think, in fairness, what I'm really telling you, I'm here to try to save the world. And I would like and hope that I've encouraged you to think that you can do the same. I suspect it's time to say thank you. Thank you.